So here we are to conclude the three-part journey of the best and worst horror movies of 2023. I know, I'm still talking about 2023 and it's 2024. I'm late, I will admit that. Last night, I got to go out with friends. I got to have this surprise party for my birthday, so I'm still unwinding. And also I got this sick shirt from my friend Sarah. She knows I love Art the Clown. I love Terrifier 2, which was my number one for 2022 of best movie. So I love it. It just says, Art Krispies. I also did get this 3D printed spider from my friend Maria. Look how adorable that is. As you all know, I do have tarantulas, so I was holding onto it at the bar like it was a baby, clutching onto it like, oh my God. You can move it, just lays on you. It's so adorable. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with this video. So the first one is actually not necessarily on the list. It's an honorable mention, and that is When Evil Lurks. So this one comes to us from Damien Rugna, who brought us the 2017 film Terrified, a movie that in hindsight, I'm like, how did I not see it sooner? This one is set in a rural farmland miles away from the nearest town. Its focus is on two brothers who discover this body and encounter their bloated neighbor who is possessed, and they refer to as an encarnado. When Evil Lurks does have a refreshing and unique take on possession, which is treated more like a disease or biological infestation. To say this movie is violent would be an understatement because there are some really graphic scenes. Some that really catch you off guard. For example, there is a scene that I'm not going to talk too much in detail involving a child, but when it happens, you feel the dread that's like building up. But the way that things pan out, it's just so left field. It just happens in a jolt and you don't have enough time to process the brutality. You're constantly on high alert before something worse happens. Following the protagonist alongside him learning about the disease, there's bureaucratic indifference with government officials knowing about the encarnado, but choosing not to treat it or not get involved. They remain neutral. And what was interesting reading about When Evil Lurks is that the director got his idea from a series of news stories involving farm pesticides in his home country of Argentina. Truthfully, I really don't have much to say about When Evil Lurks because I would need another viewing experience to really let it sink in. But the first time I watched it, there were a lot of high expectations because of the buzz surrounding this movie and everybody saying it's so brutal, it's, so violent and relentless, merciless. Yeah, maybe my expectations were lowered, but I still think it's a really good movie. It's one that I really would love to dissect a little bit further because I don't think it's just, gratuitous violence for the sake of it, even though I do like movies like that as well. But definitely a film worth checking out that had its premiere at Fantastic Fest and then later on went to Shudder. It's a movie that definitely is unique in the sense that it removes that equation of the religious aspects in possession films. There are ways in which you have to treat the rotten, not killing them for one. They can inhabit children, men, women, all the adults, even animals. It brings about this form of psychosis where people are so deathly afraid of the possession. Let me know if you've watched this movie and what you think of When Evil Lurks, but let's go ahead and continue with number 14. And that is In My Mother's Skin, a grim fairy tale that's set in the Philippines in 1945. So this one does involve Japanese forces who have occupied the country. We're primarily following Tala, which I also found out it means star in Filipino, and her brother Bayani, in this twisted Hansel and Gretel-like retelling. Now, the start of this movie, there is flesh-eating gruesomeness, which may appeal to horror fans who favor gore in their horror movies. There is more carnage later on in the film, but that's not its main focus. It's serving more so as a cautionary tale. It does have a slower pace to it because you're getting introduced to all these characters, which only builds this uneasy feeling once we're introduced to this malevolent fairy in the forest. She comes across trustworthy and kind, at least Atala, who's draped in this ornate attire and headpiece similar to a religious statue. But there's always a give and take, and this fairy's gifts lead to cannibalistic desires. And with the gifts that Tala receives from the fairy, she does wish that her mother be well, which she ends up becoming an aswang. That's what I looked up online as far as Filipino folklore and mythological creatures, which is an all-encompassing thing. It's various different mythological creatures. This is a really bleak film. The ending of the movie, it might not be satisfying to most people because there's no definitive conclusion of what happens to our main character. The little girl who plays Tala, Felicity Napoli, gives a wonderful performance. It's actually very harrowing. It's haunting when she's screaming and crying and writhing in pain, because a particular character dies, several people die. I don't want to give too much away, but it's just, man, it's a bleak ending. It's a bleak, dark, and grim movie. Wow. Wow. That is quite a difference, you guys. 86% for critics and 57% from audience scores. I'm really curious, like why is that? I'm gonna have to read more about this, because coming in at number 13, we have Birth Rebirth, a movie that I didn't really know much about until I watched it on Shudder, and wow, what a surprise. So this one does have more of a dreary and gloomy setting, especially utilizing the hospital, as we're introduced to two polarizing individuals living totally different lives. So we have Celia, who's a maternity nurse working endless hours while providing for her daughter. And then there's Rose, a pathologist who's incapable of social interaction beyond her medical expertise, who tampers with illegal and unethical experiments, to say the least. It's like a mesh of Frankenstein and Reanimator, except it's its own unique piece. It's grounded, and that's what I really enjoyed about this movie, especially the performances with Marin Ireland, Judy Reyes, when they're defying the natural order, when Celia's daughter dies of bacterial meningitis. And so Rose decides to reanimate her, bring her back from the dead with this cure that she has, this death-defying cure that she has, I should say. Like I said, maybe it's the fact that the movie is so grounded in its subject matter, which makes it an uncomfortable watch, but I think it's also this other extra layer of the fact that Rose reminds me, from the time that I've worked in medical labs in the past, she reminds me of a supervisor that I had, like spot on, who was super analytical and just devoid of emotion. But also when I think about it, bring in something that's anecdotal from my own experience. Maybe that's not the best assessment of this character, Rose, because you do get to learn more about her and what's propelled her to be the hypercritical, analytical individual that she is. There's some really awkwardly hilarious moments in this movie that are just like, the comedy is there. It's subtle, but it's there, and it's really awkward because there's a scene where she's at this bar and she spots this guy and she gives him an offer to, go meet her in the bathroom stall to masturbate him. And then she extracts his semen to then later on go home and inseminate herself. So I'm just laughing at it because it's so awkward and weird. Hey, he consented, so you do you. I mean, in the end, I had a really fun time watching this movie, exploring the moral fabric of right and wrong, life and death, etc. Coming in at number 12, Color Me Shocked. It's VHS 85. I love this movie. I can't believe I have a VHS movie on my best of the year, because last year, you've seen my last year's best and worst, where 99 fell. Yeah. Polar opposites, wow. So this one is described as a heart-pounding journey into the grim underbelly of the forgotten 1980s through the 5 tales of terror on a taped-over, made-for-TV documentary. I'm still sticking to my guns that Mike P. Nelson's No Wake / Ambrosia is the best segment. The cultish overtones, a dark tradition ending in an all-out gunfight, Aztec mythology, digital takeover. I think it keeps hold of its main point, all these things, while still being a total splatterfest. Did have my reservations given the previous release, but I'm content that this entry, which is 85, also a decade that I love, one of my favorite decades for horror, did stick with me. From what I've read, they are taking a step back from focusing on specific decades, and instead VHS is delving further into sci-fi space territory. At number 11, we have Ari Aster's Beau is Afraid, which is a surrealist journey following Beau Wasserman, a middle-aged man riddled with anxiety and fears, making the long trek back home to attend his mother's funeral. Along the way, he comes across frightening and absurd obstacles. It's a 3-hour-long allegorical tale akin to Homer's The Odyssey, or Franz Kafka's The Judgment. I honestly love this film from the first frame to the last, even the progression of events. It feels like these separate incidents could be a short film of their own, but the way it's pieced together had a deeper impact. As someone who is riddled with anxiety, I definitely resonated with a lot of this movie and a lot of my own anxieties of just going outside and interacting with people or trying to make a good impression. Even his mannerisms when he's just like, thank you, sorry, and I'm like, oh God, I've been that person. I've been that person where I've apologized so much and I'm like, no, stop. So watching that was kind of like a cathartic moment, just something that I need to work on, because I've done that before and I really don't like that I do that when I overly apologize for things that I haven't even done. But I think it's my own way of internalizing, feeling like I'm a burden to others, I guess. This film delves into childhood trauma, maternal dependence, abuse, celibacy via sexual repression. And then there are other themes as well. It explores Freudian concepts like the Oedipus complex with his mom, who is just awful. Awful generational wealth and controlling every aspect of Beau. Because there's a certain point where Beau is climbing up into the attic, and I took that as a very psychological metaphor for like his unconscious mind, because he sees another version of himself that's chained up, the monster in this movie, which is front and center. If you've watched this movie, I'd like to know in the comments what you thought of that, if you stuck around long enough. This is another movie that I think is polarizing, where people feel differently about, as far as the duration of it, as far as the merits of it. I don't know what it is. I think this is perhaps Ari Aster's most ambitious work, and I felt so many things watching it, and that's the greatest thing about film as a medium. I just had a range of emotions as I was watching it. It's not a movie that you can just like check off in a box because it covers horror. There are horror elements. It's comedic, and the comedy in this is pretty subtle. It's really funny. I was laughing. I don't think Blair really laughed, but I caught it. I'll probably talk about this movie in a separate video. I'm gonna have to watch it once more and really let it sink in. As far as the ending, there's like foreshadowing, because there's a part where like a child is playing with this boat that he capsizes. Yeah, I'm not gonna say how the movie ends, but relation to that. All right, coming in at number 10, we have Infinity Pool, which is Brandon Cronenberg's latest film looking at wealthy elites with time to kill. Quite literally. After a day of fun exploring beyond the bounds of the luxurious resort in Latolka, James gets into an accident with radical consequences. What follows is a corrupted legal system, a get-out clause, doppelgangers galore, and this horror sci-fi filled with hedonism. Now, I'm really curious what the Motion Picture Association came to the conclusion that Cronenberg pushed the envelope a little bit too far with this film, which had an NC-17 rating. And then he condensed it down a little bit. I think it was maybe 5 minutes worth or so, or maybe even less than that, of footage to get that R rating. This movie was shot in Croatia and Hungary. You could definitely see that with the brutalist architecture. But as far as the characters in this film, most of them are pretty ordinary. James and his wife, M, there seems to be like some imbalance there, or like maybe they're not as invested in this vacation. He seems defeated about this novel that he has written that has like a negative review, which you find out the bigger picture of things when they're introduced to Mia Goth's character, Gabby, and her husband, and the type of people that they surround themselves with. I've already talked about this movie in a review, but to reiterate, I think what makes this movie terrifying is that these ordinary people, the lengths that they'll go to commit these crimes, and being that they are rich, that they can get out of this situation by having themselves cloned. Watching their clones be executed and treating it more of like a spectacle, like a thrill ride. Easily he was able to allow these individuals to infiltrate him, to get him to join them, thinking that he's a part of their group, when really he's not. He's just a plaything that they can easily manipulate, and that is sad. There are some poignant lines being delivered in this movie that are just embedded in your brain that just make you reflect on the themes that this movie is exploring, such as Gabby when she brings out a clone of James who's walking on a leash. She says, "It's time for you to shed that disgusting larval mind of yours and find out what kind of creature you really are." So in the end, James comes to the realization that he's no better than them, that despite him being disgusted by his actions and coming to his senses a little too late, he's a horrible person who is desperately seeking validation. A lot of this movie is basically personal identity. We don't know exactly. It's not explicitly mentioned. We're constantly wondering whether the clone was in fact killed or if it was the real version of themselves. Which version actually took a dip into the infinity gene pool? Yeah, I'll see myself out. At number 9, we have Wesera, the Bone Woman. In this story involving motherhood, we're following Valeria. She is thrust into terrifying experiences when an entity latches onto her after becoming pregnant. I would describe this as hauntingly beautiful, especially the shots at the beginning when you get to see this shrine, this monumental golden statue of the Virgin of Guadalupe. I think what this movie does achieve really well is that it's seamlessly blending pregnancy, body horror, with supernatural elements. Valeria does have a habit of cracking her fingers and her back that intensifies with each situation she's in. Great utilization of sounds with the bones cracking. In the movie, you see her constantly criticized by everyone around her, either her family, her husband Raoul, even Octavia, and it does place an importance on domesticity, on conforming to familial and societal norms. With all these expectations and judgment that's placed on her, Valeria seems to have not only a difficult time with her pregnancy, but also being in the predicament of choosing what she wants, her outcome, versus what everyone wants for her, leading a heteronormative lifestyle. If you haven't watched this one, I would highly recommend it because it is cathartic. It does utilize the mythology of the Bone Woman really well into the story. There's a lot more that I could explore with this. All right, coming in at number 8, we have The Last Voyage of the Demeter. You know, with the array of vampire films that exist, this one fixates more on a particular narrative of the Dracula mythos. When the crew of the Demeter venture off to London, unaware that Dracula is temporarily dormant beneath the ship. This was another film that people either hated or felt mixed on, but I personally really enjoyed it because it is an adaptation of The Captain's Log from Stoker's novel. This one I would definitely describe as a slow burner that takes its time before you really get to see Dracula's wrath. Javier Botet plays Dracula and brings this Nosferatu-esque, feral, gaunt, blood-sucking monstrosity to life. And I think that's what adds a unique layer to the story because he does act on primal instincts. Dracula, that is. Unleashing carnage, removing that aspect of Dracula that's more human, charming, or seductive. It's pretty terrifying with the way it moves, with its proportions. Just a really interesting creature design. The makeup, the effects that were used, the balance with CG and practical, and the way the story concludes as well, because it's not necessarily a conclusion. I feel like they could make it into a sequel if they wish, so we'll see. Fingers crossed on that, because I wouldn't mind. Coming in at number 7, Scream 6 slashed its way to theaters on March 10th, following the survivors of the previous installment as they try to move forward from their horrific ordeal in a new setting, New York City, baby. When this movie came out, I'm pretty sure I watched it 2 to 3 times. I still highly enjoy this movie. The majority of this film, I'm still not a fan of the reveal. And while it does have similarities to Scream 2, which is in fact my favorite of all films, I feel like it just seemed excessive with some of the characters that do end up surviving after being stabbed brutally multiple times. It just seemed a little illogical, and just allowing that character to live just to appease fans, I'm assuming. On the other hand, what I was saying about the majority of this movie just being entertaining and perfection is that we have the core 4, and they carry it. Melissa Barrera, Jenna Ortega, which, sad. I am very sad that they're not going to be returning for Scream 7. I don't even know what's going on with Scream 7 because I haven't kept up with it. You know, regarding Melissa Barrera and her speaking out, saying there should be an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, which I agree with. It's been twisted as her being anti-Semitic, which I don't agree with her being fired. Back to Scream 6, I think that's what made me really like this movie, more so than 5. At this point, all the characters have been established and we've gotten to know them. And seeing their mental state and how they're processing the ordeal from the previous film onto this one. And I'm just gonna say it, I'm pretty sure I talked about it in my review of Scream 6, but Sam is by far my favorite character. I wasn't really a big fan of her in Scream 5, but she's just established her role as a certified badass. Overall, what makes Scream 6 such an effective movie is that it diverts from the usual. We now have this major city for Ghostface to terrorize. Even the escape and chase scenes that bring the stakes way up. The kills in this one are by far, I would say, the most brutal. If I were to pick one, just one part of this movie that I love the most, which would be difficult because there are many, but it would have to be when Ghostface is in the bodega, like rocking his shotgun. That was something different. At number 6, we have a movie that was delayed for quite a while, and I was so happy I finally got to see it, and that is Dark Harvest. So this one takes place in 1962 and tells the story of a Halloween tradition, selecting a group of boys, depriving them of food to then go on the hunt for a being only known as Sawtooth Jack. So basically, you have a group of boys who have to stop this creature from getting near the church. If not, they fail, which puts their crops and livelihood in jeopardy. And then there's also this incentive of the person who wins, the boy who wins, who is able to prevent Sawtooth Jack from reaching the church, wins $25,000 for their family and a Corvette. In this movie, we do have Richie, who is the main protagonist of the film. His older brother does win one year and just sets off into the night, never to be seen again. Admittedly, there are plot holes and more questions than answers, But I actually thoroughly enjoyed the stylization. It's oozing in this like dark fantasy, heavily saturated autumnal feel. It does include topics of disparity, such as socioeconomic status. There's some racism. There's some kids that are bullies. There are parents that just give you that picturesque, like suburban type family. I mean, it's more of like a farmland or agricultural area where they live, but Richie's mom specifically always smiling, which is a creepy part of this movie. But aside from the peculiar townsfolk, I really like Sawtooth Jack. I really like the design of this creature. Reminds me of a distant cousin of Pumpkinhead and Sam. I mean, because clearly I have Sam over here, like I have a lot of Sam. Coming in at number 5, we have Thanksgiving. I mean, you're not gonna be able to fully see it, but if it's not obvious by the poster, Grindhouse is my shit. So when I heard that a mock trailer from Grindhouse, Thanksgiving, was going to be made into a full-length film, yes, I was ready. Anyway, this movie is about a superstore that erupts in pandemonium for the residents of Plymouth, Massachusetts on Black Friday. A year after the tragedy, an axe-wielding killer donning the John Carver pilgrim mask goes on a killing spree. Considering the tagline of this film, which is "There will be no leftovers," I expected a lot of gore, of course, the mock trailer, and this movie did not disappoint in that department. Like, there are two vividly in my mind right now that are so disgusting yet just fit perfectly within this slasher. Now with this slasher whodunit situation, I don't know, like I said, I did it with Totally Killer. I called it with this one. I think it made it so obvious early on. There's a character in the movie that makes it so obvious that it's a red herring. It's not the killer. And then you have like all the shoppers at the beginning going out in like a Super Smash Bros. Like fight, beating the crap out of each other. Like someone is scalped, I think, in the movie. Just so over the top ridiculous. I mean, is it really an exaggeration when you watch YouTube videos of the way people behave during Black Friday, just beating the crap out of each other? And then on top of that, I found out that Roth filmed the whole movie in 35 days, with the opening riot alone taking 4 nights, 2 each for inside and outside the store where it takes place. Sometimes you're just not in the mood for those films that fall within the elevated horror category. You just want like a nice, good slasher, something you don't have to overthink or really think about. You can just watch a bunch of carnage unfold. I was really happy to see Eli Roth come back because I do like his movies. I mean, Hostel, the first one, like I said, traumatizing. And then The Green Inferno I actually really like. All right, guys, we're getting down to the last few films. At number 4, we have Talk to Me. Mia and her group of friends summon spirits using an embalmed hand. When she contacts who she thinks is her mother, a domino effect ensues, taking their thrill too far. I'm gonna use the term friend very loosely from that description because they didn't have her best interests at heart, Mia's. And the same could be said about Mia herself towards Riley and what happens to him and the conditions that he's left in because, yeah, the visuals in this movie with Riley, everything happening to Riley is very upsetting. Definitely a metaphor for drug use, sustaining or fulfilling that high, which obviously doesn't fulfill their needs because they have to constantly do it. They have to get that next rush, all the while recording themselves, which I think is a great take considering the world that we live in. To be honest, what I was saying about In My Mother's Skin being bleak, no, I think Talk to Me definitely takes the cake. This movie was bleak. It was sad. It got me in my feelings after the theater experience where I was discussing it with Blair and his younger brother Cross. Coming in at number 3, we have Evil Dead Rise. The Necronomicon Ex Mortis, aka The Book of the Dead, is unearthed quite literally once again in this new Evil Dead installment by Lee Cronin. Watched this movie twice in theaters and then 2 times more on Max. I love that Lee Cronin adds his own spin on the Necronomicon and the Deadites, while still keeping it in the vein of Fede Alvarez's 2013 film, while also paying respect to the previous films that have come out. From the start of the film, we're in a familiar territory, an isolated cabin, a nice nod there. Then shift locations to a high-rise apartment building where Beth pays her sister Ellie and her children a visit. That cheese grater scene will forever be ingrained in my mind though. Going into this movie, I really thought Beth would be my favorite character, but it was actually Ellie, the mom. I felt really bad for her because you see that she's a mother that does care about her children who's struggling, but keeping things afloat. But that elevator scene was just so badass. The way she gets taken over before she goes full on Deadite, which is more of a process. I mean, yeah, what is there to say? Like the chanting, the boomstick, the chainsaw, the gruesomeness of it all. I love it. I love the Evil Dead franchise. It's perhaps one of my favorite, and I think it's one of the more consistent ones. Now, Evil Dead Rise, I think it falls like on the lowest point in the totem pole as far as like if you look at all the movies. It's definitely not my favorite in that terms, but as far as like doing this ranking, looking at it on its own, of its own merits, yes, I think it's one of the better films that we've gotten in 2023. And then towards the third act, we get the big boss battle with the Marauder. So that's when Ellie's limbs get blown off and the children and everyone who's now Deadite goes into her, basically becoming part of her limbs. They all conjoin and become this monstrosity, this icky monster. It was definitely like, to me, I was thinking of Resident Evil. I'm pretty sure I stated that in my review. And I don't think I was a big fan of it, but now I'm like, I'm okay with it. I wanted to include some images from Odd Studio, who created the creature suit for the Marauder. See, I would do that. Like if I could, if I had the experience, if I went to school for special effects makeup, that's what I would want to do. Another big surprise for me this year was Saw 10, a film that takes place between the first and second film, following John Kramer as he travels to Mexico for an experimental procedure to treat his terminal brain cancer, only to be conned. He decides to exact retribution with a new game in mind. So adding a new adversary to the mix, Cecilia, was a great inclusion. She's so cold-blooded and calculated. I keep reflecting on her fate, and I feel like she deserved way worse than what everybody else got in that film. But man, that hubris was her downfall. In all honesty, these aren't the most ambitious traps that we've seen like in the other films, which I don't mean in a negative way, because I actually do like that it's balanced between complexity and simplicity. All the traps are deliberately placed for each character's own moral issues, and it just fits perfectly between both films, having that grainy, industrial, like grimy look to it, which I'm glad that they went back to that format instead of a few of the later films that are a little bit more polished or clean. But seeing John and Amanda on the big screen, just having this more intimate driven story that's adding more context beyond what we knew of John Kramer, it's a lot more emotional. Upon my second watch, it did push some of these binary concepts I had of good or bad to the side, because ultimately these characters are flawed to different degrees. I'm also going to link this article that I read entirely about the sound designers Adam Stein and David Rose. It's a pretty lengthy discussion, but really worth it. If you have the time, please go read it. They go through the equipment used to capture and manipulate sounds for each trap. My number one horror movie of 2023 is Hell House LLC Origins, The Carmichael Manor. Yep. I'm so excited. A found footage movie made it to my number one. So this one is a prequel, but I use that term quite loosely because it's kind of like a quasi prequel. I think a more proper prequel, which how many times am I going to say that word, would have been exploring Andrew Tolle entirely, his cohorts and the missing children from the state fair or carnival. I honestly hope that happens, but here's the wishful thinking. But despite what I just said, this is by far my favorite Hell House movie. When I watch Hell House movies, I have to watch it in its entirety. Like I have to watch all of them. I'll do a marathon because I think that's the best way to do it. But this one is my favorite. I like it more than the first Hell House film. In this installment, we follow Margot, her girlfriend Rebecca, and her brother Chase as they set out to film a true crime expose on the Carmichael Manor, the site of the 1989 Carmichael family murders. Not long before they are thrust into a haunting they cannot escape, filled with demonic clowns and a cult. So I think this movie was the most effective for me at creeping me out when I watched it in the middle of the night. Being a bit paranoid and thinking that something from my peripheral that I was seeing when it wasn't really there, I don't know. I know it's not going to work for everyone, and people may question why I have this at my number one. I genuinely was creeped out. And even in its moments where it's more rooted in simplicity with having like random objects being moved across the house, or doors opening, or footsteps, or seeing the clowns like move position, it all worked for me. It literally all creeped me out. I was like, all right, you've got me invested with like a haunting, with like this cult that we don't really know too much about. Like how it bridges the Abaddon Hotel and the Carmichael Manor together. Like you learn so much. So despite what I said about it not being a proper prequel, it really doesn't matter because at the end of it, we got a really great film. I think after I finish this video, I am going to rewatch it because all of a sudden now I got really invested and intrigued in kind of picking those pieces out that I missed before that you find out later on in the film with Margot and her connection to the Carmichael Manor and the Abaddon Hotel. Margot is also a really interesting character to follow because on one end, I do like her, but also she is so persistent with uncovering the truth. I think if you watched a Hell House movie, you know it doesn't end well for anybody. Literally, I don't think anyone makes it out alive. I really hope we get to see what Stephen Cognetti explores further with the Hell House LLC franchise. But yeah, this has been an interesting 3-part video trying to get through all these films. Let me know what your top best horror films of 2023 were. I hope you enjoyed this video. Comment down below, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye, guys.